Anton Levchenko had always been a name whispered among art critics in Ukraine. His abstract works, imbued with raw emotion, had earned him accolades and envy alike. But success brought its shadows. After years of relentless exhibitions, commissions, and acclaim, Anton found himself staring at blank canvases with nothing to offer. Creativity had abandoned him, leaving only frustration. On a stormy November night, as the rain lashed against the windows of his small Kyiv studio, Anton received an unexpected parcel. The sender was anonymous, and inside was an ancient-looking leather-bound journal, its pages covered in faded symbols and sketches. Intrigued and desperate for inspiration, he flipped through the pages. The symbols, spirals, geometric shapes, and peculiar sigils seemed almost alive, pulsating under the dim light of his desk lamp. That night, Anton had a dream. He was standing in a vast, dark expanse where glowing lines wrapped around his arms and chest, forming intricate patterns. A voice, deep and resonant, whispered to him in a language he couldn't understand. When he woke up, his heart pounding, he discovered something impossible. The patterns from his dream were now etched into his skin, starting from his forearm and spiraling toward his shoulder. At first, Anton believed he had done it to himself during a fit of sleepless delirium. Perhaps he had drawn them without realizing it. But no marker, pen, or paint matched the vibrant black ink embedded in his skin. Over the following days, the patterns grew. Each morning revealed new lines, extending across his chest, down his other arm, and even onto his back. They were not random. They were precise, almost architectural in design. Anton's friends began to notice the changes. "What's with the tattoos?" his close friend Oksana asked over coffee. "They look strange." "I didn't get tattoos," Anton replied, his voice trembling. "They just appeared." She laughed it off, assuming he was joking, but Anton knew better. Along with the growing patterns came vivid dreams of labyrinthine caverns and an underwater temple, lit by an otherworldly glow. He began to paint again, driven by an uncontrollable urge. His new works were unlike anything he had ever created, haunting landscapes and surreal figures that seemed to vibrate with hidden energy. Collectors flocked to buy these pieces, praising their unsettling beauty, but Anton felt no pride. He wasn't creating these works, they were being forced out of him. As the weeks passed, the influence of the symbols grew stronger. They weren't just markings anymore. They pulsed beneath his skin, sometimes causing searing pain. And then came the whispers. At first, they were faint, like the echo of wind through a hollow space. But soon, they grew louder, filling his mind with commands he couldn't disobey. Paint, show them, bring them closer. Anton's paintings became darker, more violent. People who viewed them described feeling as though the artwork was watching them, drawing them into its depths. A few even reported hearing whispers themselves. At least one collector suffered a nervous breakdown after purchasing one of Anton's canvases, claiming that the figures in the painting were moving. Meanwhile, Anton began to change. He became withdrawn, irritable, and distant. His appetite dwindled, and his once sharp features grew gaunt. Oksana tried to intervene, urging him to seek help, but he pushed her away. "It's the art," he insisted. "It's important. You wouldn't understand." But Oksana did understand, at least partly. She had been researching the symbols she had seen on Anton's skin, and what she discovered terrified her. The markings resembled those of an ancient cult that worshipped an entity called Ri'shal, a forgotten god described in obscure Slavic folklore. According to legend, Ri'shal was a being that could not fully manifest in the human world without a key, a vessel marked with his sigils. Anton, it seemed, was becoming that vessel. One evening, Anton invited a gallery owner to his studio to discuss an upcoming exhibit. As they stood before his latest piece, a grotesque, hypnotic swirl of light and shadow, the man collapsed. At first, Anton thought it was a heart attack, but when he approached, he saw the truth. The gallery owner's eyes were wide open, staring in terror, and his lips were moving soundlessly, as though trying to scream. The symbols on Anton's body burned, and he felt a rush of exhilaration. He understood, with horrifying clarity, what had happened. The painting had consumed the man's mind, feeding the entity that now shared Anton's body. That night, the whispers grew louder. They demanded more. Word of Anton's work spread far and wide, attracting more than just art lovers. A group of mysterious individuals began attending his exhibitions, people who seemed less interested in the art itself and more in Anton. They called themselves the Awakened and claimed to be disciples of Ri'shal. They spoke of Anton as if he were a prophet, the chosen one destined to bring their God into the world. The whispers in Anton's mind encouraged him to trust them, and soon he found himself surrounded by these zealots. They provided him with resources, offering to fund his work and even protect him from the authorities after the gallery owner's mysterious death drew police attention. Anton, now barely in control of his own thoughts, allowed them to guide him. The Awakened revealed that the symbols on his body were a map, one that led to a submerged temple in the Carpathian region. There, they claimed, Ri'shal awaited his return. Despite a small part of him that still resisted, Anton boarded a train to the Carpathians with his new followers. Oksana, desperate to save him, followed from a distance. She had found an expert in folklore, Professor Yuri Ravinsky, who explained that the only way to stop Ri'shal was to destroy the vessel before the final ritual could be completed. But time was running out. Anton's transformation was nearly complete, and the whispers had turned into a deafening roar. Soon, he would no longer be himself. The air in the Carpathians was thin and biting cold. Anton stood at the mouth of a cavern, his body trembling, not from fear, but from the overwhelming presence within him. The sigils on his skin now glowed faintly, pulsing in rhythm with his heartbeat. Around him, the Awakened knelt, murmuring prayers in an ancient tongue that Anton somehow understood. Oksana and Professor Ravinsky watched from a nearby ridge, concealed by the dense foliage. Ravinsky studied the scene through binoculars, his expression grim. "The markings are fully activated," he muttered. "He's almost completely under its control. We can still save him," Oksana insisted, though doubt gnawed at her. "We have to." The cavern entrance gaped like a wound in the mountainside, leading down into darkness. Anton's mind was no longer his own. The voice of Ri'shal had drowned out every thought, every memory. It urged him forward, and he obeyed. The group descended into the cavern, their torches casting flickering shadows on the damp walls. The air grew heavier with every step, thick with the stench of decay and something more ancient. The symbols on Anton's body began to shift and writhe as if alive, guiding him deeper. At the heart of the cavern, they found it, a massive stone altar surrounded by water. The Awakened fell silent, their gazes fixed on Anton as he stepped forward. His hands moved without his volition, tracing patterns in the air. The waters around the altar began to ripple, and the sigils on his skin flared with blinding light. Oksana and Ravinsky crept closer, keeping to the shadows. The professor whispered, "If he completes the ritual, Ri'shal will be reborn. We can't let him open the portal." "How do we stop him?" Oksana asked. "Destroy the altar," Ravinsky replied. "And if that fails, we must stop him directly." As Anton stood before the altar, his followers began chanting, their voices rising in unison. The air vibrated with energy, and the water around the altar parted, revealing a set of ancient stone steps leading down into darkness. The portal was opening. Oksana couldn't wait any longer. She burst from the shadows, a crowbar in her hands, and sprinted toward the altar. "Anton, stop!" The Awakened reacted instantly, blocking her path. Ravinsky followed, wielding a flashlight and shouting incantations in an effort to disrupt the ritual. Chaos erupted. The professor managed to shine his light directly at Anton, momentarily breaking the demon's hold. Anton's eyes flickered with recognition. "Oksana," he whispered, his voice weak and pained. But then the sigils on his body flared again, and he screamed in agony. The ground beneath him cracked, and a wave of force knocked everyone back. The Awakened regrouped, but Oksana reached the altar first. She swung the crowbar with all her strength, smashing into the ancient stone. Cracks spread across its surface, and the ritual faltered. The waters surged violently, threatening to drown the cavern. Anton fell to his knees, clutching his head as the voice of Ri'shal roared in fury. "Finish it!" the demon bellowed, forcing Anton to rise. Anton's body convulsed, and the sigils began to burn into his flesh, tearing through his skin. His screams echoed through the cavern as his form started to change. His arms elongated, his spine arched unnaturally, and his eyes glowed with an otherworldly light. He was becoming the vessel. Oksana froze, paralyzed by the horror of what her friend was becoming. Ravinsky grabbed her arm. "We have to leave now." "No," she shouted. "We can still reach him." But it was too late. Anton, or what was left of him, rose from the ground, his body a grotesque fusion of flesh and glowing symbols. His voice was no longer his own. "The time has come. The world will kneel before Ri'shal." The portal began to widen, revealing a glimpse of the being that awaited on the other side. A colossal shadow with countless eyes and writhing limbs. Its presence alone was enough to sap the strength from Oksana's legs. Ravinsky, armed with a flask of holy water and a ceremonial dagger, charged at Anton. The awakened moved to stop him, but Oksana fought them off with raw desperation. "Anton, please," she screamed. "You have to fight it." For a brief moment, Anton hesitated. The glow in his eyes dimmed, and his distorted features twisted in anguish. "Oksana, I'm sorry," he rasped, his voice barely audible over the roaring portal. "Then help us stop this," she pleaded. Summoning every ounce of his remaining will, Anton turned toward the portal. "Destroy me," he said, his voice breaking. "It's the only way." "No," Oksana cried, but Ravinsky didn't hesitate. He plunged the dagger into Anton's chest, piercing the largest sigil. Anton screamed, and the cavern erupted in light. The sigils on his body shattered, releasing a torrent of energy that consumed the portal and the shadowy form of Ri'shal. The cavern began to collapse, forcing Oksana and Ravinsky to flee. The last thing Oksana saw before the rocks sealed the cavern was Anton's body, engulfed in a fiery glow, his face peaceful for the first time in weeks. Weeks later, Oksana stood in a gallery displaying Anton's final works. The paintings, recovered from his studio, had been sold to collectors around the world. They were hailed as masterpieces, but Oksana knew the truth. The sigils in the paintings had not faded. They remained, faint but visible, waiting. Ravinsky's words haunted her. "We stopped Ri'shal this time, but his influence is never truly gone." As she left the gallery, a faint whisper brushed against her mind, a voice she prayed she would never hear again. Oksana couldn't shake the memory of Anton's final plea, nor could she escape the whisper that had followed her since that fateful day in the Carpathians. She tried to rationalize it, stress, grief, maybe even trauma, but the voice in her head wasn't just a trick of the mind. It had a presence, a weight, and its words were growing clearer. "Do not turn away. You are marked." The sigils had vanished from Anton's body when he died, but their essence had seeped into the world through his paintings. Each artwork, now scattered across various private collections, bore fragments of Ri'shal's power. Oksana began seeing patterns emerge, strange accidents surrounding the buyers, reports of hallucinations, and whispers of cult-like behavior in cities where the paintings were displayed. Professor Ravinsky had retreated to his small apartment in Lviv, surrounded by books and scrolls, desperately searching for a way to contain the remnants of Ri'shal's influence. But the entity was clever, and its tendrils were already spreading. Determined to stop the growing threat, Oksana set out to track down the paintings. Her first target was a wealthy collector in Vienna, who had purchased one of Anton's most disturbing pieces, the Gatekeeper. The painting depicted a monstrous figure standing before a spiraling doorway, its eyes glowing with malevolent intelligence. When Oksana arrived at the collector's mansion, she found the man seated in his study, staring blankly at the painting. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and unblinking. He muttered to himself, repeating the same phrase over and over. "It's calling. It's calling." The room reeked of decay. Oksana approached cautiously, her heart pounding. When she touched the man's shoulder, he jolted violently, as if waking from a nightmare. His eyes locked onto hers, and for a brief moment, she saw something unnatural staring back, a flicker of Ri'shal. Before she could react, the man let out a guttural scream and collapsed. Oksana fled the room, grabbing the painting as she ran. She knew she couldn't destroy it. These works were more than just paint and canvas. They were conduits, and destroying them might release something far worse. As Oksana returned to Ukraine with the gatekeeper, she realized she was being followed. The awakened, thought to have been eradicated in the Carpathian collapse, were not only alive but growing in number. They had reorganized, using the scattered paintings as focal points for their rituals. Each painting served as a beacon, drawing followers to them like moths to a flame. Oksana sought out Ravinsky, who had uncovered a crucial piece of information. The paintings were fragments of Rishal's consciousness. If brought together, they could form a new vessel for the entity. The professor devised a plan to neutralize the paintings by sealing them in a specially prepared ritual chamber deep beneath Lviv's old city. But the cult was always one step ahead. The awakened attacked Ravinsky's apartment while Oksana was there, forcing them to flee. They barely escaped with their lives, losing the gatekeeper in the chaos. As they regrouped, Ravinsky revealed that the cult was already moving to complete their ritual. They had tracked down the remaining paintings and were converging on Kiev, where the final stage of Rishal's rebirth would take place. "This is it," Ravinsky said, his voice trembling. "If they succeed, there will be no stopping him." Oksana felt a surge of guilt and anger. She had dragged Anton into this by encouraging him to push boundaries in his art, never realizing the cost. Now, she was determined to end it, no matter the price. In Kiev, the cult had taken over an abandoned cathedral, its grand arches and crumbling walls the perfect setting for their ritual. As Oksana and Ravinsky infiltrated the building, they saw the paintings arranged in a circle around a massive sigil carved into the floor. The awakened chanted in unison, their voices echoing through the cavernous space. At the center of the circle, a figure stood, a man whose body bore the same glowing sigils that had once marked Anton. The vessel was ready. Oksana and Ravinsky knew they had to act quickly. Ravinsky began preparing a counter-ritual, using ancient texts he had smuggled into the cathedral. Oksana, armed with a stolen pistol, confronted the cultists. Shots rang out, and chaos erupted. The chanting faltered, but the sigils on the paintings began to glow, feeding energy into the vessel. As Ravinsky completed the counter-ritual, the glowing energy from the sigils surged toward him, burning his skin and sending him to the ground. The paintings cracked and splintered, but the vessel remained intact. The awakened regrouped, their eyes filled with fanatical rage, and Oksana was cornered. In a last, desperate move, she turned her weapon on the vessel. "Anton, if you're still in there, I'm sorry," she whispered, pulling the trigger. The bullet struck the sigils on the vessel's chest, disrupting the flow of energy. The figure let out a deafening roar as the sigils burned away, and the cathedral trembled. The ritual collapsed. The paintings disintegrated, and the cultists fled in terror. The vessel fell to the ground, lifeless, but Oksana couldn't bring herself to look at his face. She staggered to Ravinsky's side, helping him to his feet as the building began to crumble. Months later, Oksana sat in her quiet apartment, staring at the one painting she had managed to save, a small, unfinished sketch Anton had once gifted her. It bore no sigils, no traces of darkness, just a simple landscape he had painted in a rare moment of peace. She still heard the whispers sometimes, faint and distant, but she told herself they were just memories. Yet, as she drifted to sleep, she couldn't ignore the feeling that someone, was still watching. The battle was over, but the war against Ri'shal was far from won. Kiev seemed unchanged on the surface. The bustling streets, towering apartment blocks, and constant hum of life created a facade of normalcy. But for Oksana, the city felt different now, like it was holding its breath. She walked among the crowds, clutching her bag tightly, the weight of Ravinsky's remaining notes and relics pressing against her side. Despite their victory in the cathedral, she knew the threat wasn't over. The sigils might have been disrupted and Ri'shal's vessel destroyed, but the cult hadn't vanished. They were scattered, regrouping, and growing bolder with each passing week. Reports of strange gatherings, inexplicable deaths, and whispered chants echoed through Kiev's darker corners. Oksana had become a fugitive in her own city. The Awakened considered her a traitor, a blasphemer who had denied them their promised God. She felt their eyes everywhere, on the metro, in the markets, even outside her apartment. Ravinsky had warned her before disappearing into hiding. They'll come for you, but you're not alone in this. One night, as Oksana studied Ravinsky's notes by the dim light of her desk lamp, she heard a knock at her door. Her pulse quickened. She grabbed a small knife she kept nearby and crept to the peephole. A man stood outside, his face obscured by the hood of his jacket. He knocked again, softly this time. "Oksana Ivanenko," he said in a low, calm voice. "I'm here to help. Ravinsky sent me." Her fingers tightened around the knife. "If that's true, tell me something only he would know." The man hesitated, then said, "He keeps a picture of his wife in his Bible, but it's upside down. He says it's so she's always looking at heaven." Oksana exhaled shakily and opened the door. The man stepped inside, pulling back his hood to reveal a sharp, weathered face. "My name's Taras," he said. "I'm not with the Awakened, but I've been tracking them for years. Ravinsky told me you're the key to stopping them." "Stopping them?" Oksana laughed bitterly. "We stopped them in the cathedral. What more can I do?" Taras' expression darkened. "You didn't stop them. You delayed them. And now they've found something worse." Taras spread a series of photographs across her table. Grainy images showed a crumbling, snow-covered structure somewhere in the mountains. "This is an old Soviet research facility," he explained. "Back in the 70s, they found something buried in the ice, a fragment of what they thought was an ancient artifact. It's part of Ri'shal." Oksana's stomach twisted. "How can you be sure?" "The Awakened are sure. That's why they're heading there now," Taras said. "They believe this fragment can restore the connection to Ri'shal and give them another chance to complete the ritual." She stared at the photos, dread pooling in her chest. "And you think I can stop them?" Taras nodded. "Ravinsky believed you have a connection to Anton's work, to the sigils. You resisted their influence before. That means you might be able to disrupt whatever they're planning." Oksana didn't feel brave. She felt broken, haunted by Anton's face and the whispers that still lingered in her mind. But she knew she couldn't walk away. The journey to the mountains was grueling. Taras led Oksana through a labyrinth of backroads, avoiding checkpoints and suspicious eyes. The facility, buried deep in the Carpathians, had been abandoned for decades. Snow drifts rose like walls, and the howling wind drowned out their voices as they trekked toward the site. The building loomed ahead, a monolithic structure of concrete and rust, its windows shattered and its walls scarred by time. Oksana felt the pull of something ancient and malignant the moment she stepped inside. The sigils on Anton's body had burned with the same energy that now seemed to radiate from the walls. "They're here," Taras whispered, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. "Stay close." The interior of the facility was a maze of frozen corridors and collapsed ceilings. The deeper they went, the stronger the presence became. Oksana's breaths grew shallow as faint whispers filled her ears. The walls seemed to shift, the sigils etched into them pulsing faintly in the dim light of Taras' flashlight. In the heart of the facility, they found it, a massive shard of black, glass-like material suspended in a makeshift altar. Around it, the Awakened stood in a circle, chanting in unison. Their leader, a tall woman with piercing eyes, raised her hands toward the shard. The sigils on her skin mirrored those that had marked Anton. "We can't let them finish," Taras hissed. "That shard, it's amplifying their connection." Oksana's heart raced as she realized the truth. The shard wasn't just an artifact. It was a fragment of Ri'shal's essence. If they completed the ritual, it could reawaken the entity in full force. Taras fired the first shot, breaking the ritual. Chaos erupted as the Awakened scattered, some charging toward the intruders while others tried to protect the shard. Oksana ducked behind a broken console, her hands shaking as she clutched a flare Terra's had given her. "Use it on the shard," he shouted. "The heat might destabilize it." Oksana forced herself to move, weaving through the melee. The leader of the Awakened locked eyes with her and raised an arm, sending a wave of psychic force that slammed Oksana into a wall. The whispers in her mind grew louder, more insistent. "You cannot stop us," the leader said, her voice resonating with power. "Ri'shal is inevitable." But Oksana refused to give in. Summoning every ounce of courage, she lit the flare and hurled it at the shard. The impact sent a shockwave through the room, shattering the shard into fragments. The sigils on the walls flared brightly, then faded into darkness. The leader let out a guttural scream as the connection to Ri'shal was severed. The remaining cultists fled into the shadows, their faith shattered. Terrace pulled Oksana to her feet, his face pale but determined. "We did it. For now." As they left the facility, Oksana couldn't shake the feeling that their victory was temporary. The shard was destroyed, but the whispers hadn't stopped. She could still hear them, faint but persistent, like a shadow that refused to fade. "Is it over?" she asked Terrace as they descended the mountain. "No," he admitted, "but we've bought ourselves time." Time. It wasn't much, but it was enough for Oksana to keep fighting. She wasn't the same person who had stood by Anton's side in the beginning. Now she understood the stakes. She was ready to face whatever came next. The darkness had been pushed back, but it hadn't been defeated. Ri'shal was still waiting, and Oksana knew the battle was far from over. The mountain winds howled as Oksana and Terrace descended from the crumbling facility. Snow crunched under their boots, the frozen landscape swallowing their words as they trudged in silence. Though the shard had been destroyed, Oksana felt no relief. The whispers in her mind had grown louder, a chorus of voices that seemed to mock her efforts. Terrace broke the silence. "We dealt them a blow, but they're not done. They'll find another way." "What's the point?" Oksana muttered, her breath fogging in the frigid air. "They always seem to be one step ahead. How do we stop something that refuses to die?" Terrace stopped and turned to her, his expression grim but resolute. "By refusing to let them win. Every time we fight back, we weaken their hold. You've seen it, they're desperate. That's why they're making mistakes." Oksana nodded reluctantly, though doubt lingered in her heart. The sigils, the voices, the relentless pull of Ri'shal. It felt as though she were trying to fight the tide with her bare hands. Back in Kiev, Oksana and Terrace found temporary refuge in a safe house owned by Ravinsky's network of allies. The small apartment was sparse but warm, a sharp contrast to the cold, lifeless facility they had just left behind. Ravinsky himself was there, poring over ancient texts spread across a cluttered table. "You've done well," he said as they entered, though his voice carried little warmth. His pale face and trembling hands betrayed the toll of their struggle. "But we have little time to celebrate." "What now?" Oksana asked, pulling off her gloves and collapsing onto a chair. Ravinsky gestured to one of the open books. "I've been studying the sigils you described in the facility. They match references to an artifact called the Obsidian Heart, a fragment of Rishal's core essence. The shard you destroyed was just one piece. If the Awakened gather enough fragments, they won't just reconnect with Ri'shal. They'll bring him fully into this world." Terrace cursed under his breath. "How many fragments are there?" "7, Ravinsky replied. "And the cult already has at least 3. Oksana's stomach churned. "How do we find the rest before they do?" Ravinsky hesitated. "We don't. They're scattered across the world, hidden in places of power. Tracking them all down in time is impossible. But there's another way." He pointed to a map of Kiev, where a series of intersecting lines formed a star-shaped pattern. "This city sits on a convergence of ley lines, natural channels of energy. If we can disrupt the lines using a counter-ritual, we can sever Rishal's connection to this world permanently." The counter-ritual was no simple task. Ravinsky explained that they would need to place protective wards at 5 key points across Kiev, each corresponding to a node of the ley line star. The ritual itself would be conducted at the central node, a crumbling church on the outskirts of the city. "The Awakened will try to stop us," Ravinsky warned. "They'll sense what we're doing. And if they succeed, they'll use the same convergence to summon Ri'shal. The next few days were a blur of preparation. Oksana and Teres worked tirelessly to gather the materials for the wards: candles, sigil-inscribed stones, and vials of blessed water. Ravinsky drew up detailed plans, marking routes to each node and outlining escape strategies. As the day of the ritual approached, Oksana couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. The whispers in her mind had become almost constant, urging her to abandon the fight and submit to the inevitable. On the night of the ritual, Oksana, Teres, and Ravinsky split up to place the wards. The city felt unnaturally quiet, the air heavy with tension. Oksana moved quickly through the darkened streets, her pulse racing as she reached the first node, a small park with a decrepit fountain at its center. She set the ward in place and lit the candle, muttering the incantation Ravinsky had taught her. The sigil on the stone glowed faintly, and for a moment, she felt a surge of hope. But then she heard footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and far too close. She spun around to see two cultists emerging from the shadows, their faces painted with blackened sigils. One lunged at her with a knife, but she dodged, the blade glancing off the concrete fountain. Before the second cultist could react, Teres appeared, firing a shot that sent the attacker sprawling. "Go," he shouted, covering her as more cultists closed in. "I'll hold them off." By the time Oksana reached the central node, the church was surrounded. Dozens of awakened chanted in unison, their voices reverberating through the night. The leader from the facility, her sigil-covered skin glowing faintly, stood at the altar, holding another fragment of the obsidian heart. Ravinsky was already inside, frantically preparing the final stage of the ritual. "We're out of time," he called as Oksana entered. "Hold them off while I finish." Oksana barricaded the doors, her hands shaking. The cultists outside pounded against the wood, their voices rising to a fevered pitch. She grabbed a crowbar and stood ready, knowing it was only a matter of time before they broke through. When they did, chaos erupted. The cultists surged into the church, overwhelming her with sheer numbers. She fought desperately, but they pushed closer to Ravinsky, their leader raising the fragment of the obsidian heart. "Ri'shal cannot be stopped," the leader bellowed, her voice echoing with unnatural power. As the cultists closed in, Oksana spotted a crack in the church floor where faint light seeped through. She realized with a start that it wasn't light at all. It was the energy of the ley lines converging beneath the building. Desperate, she grabbed one of Ravinsky's vials of blessed water and hurled it at the glowing fragment in the leader's hands. The fragment shattered, unleashing a wave of energy that knocked everyone to the ground. The sigils on the cultists' bodies burned away, and their leader let out a piercing scream as the connection to Ri'shal was severed once again. Ravinsky, bloodied but alive, completed the counter-ritual just as the church began to collapse. "We have to go," he shouted, dragging Oksana to her feet. The three of them fled as the building crumbled, the earth swallowing the convergence point and severing the ley lines. For a moment, the whispers in Oksana's mind fell silent. Back at the safe house, Ravinsky confirmed that the ritual had worked. Rishal's influence over Kiev was broken, and the cult was in disarray. But Oksana knew their fight was far from over. "They'll try again," she said, staring out the window at the city lights. "They always do." Ravinsky nodded. "But now we know how to fight them." As Oksana prepared to leave, she felt a faint whisper tickling the edges of her consciousness. It was quieter now, but it was still there, a reminder that Ri'shal wasn't gone. Not completely, and he was patient. The war was far from over, but for the first time, Oksana felt ready to face it. The city of Kiev returned to its rhythm, but for Oksana, there was no peace. Each day felt like a borrowed moment, a fragile calm before the storm. She spent her time studying Ravinsky's books, piecing together fragments of knowledge about Ri'shal and the Awakened. The whispers in her mind had quieted since the ritual, but they were not gone. They lurked at the edges of her consciousness, like shadows waiting to pounce. Ravinsky, though weakened from his injuries, had become even more determined. "The cult isn't defeated," he reminded her as they sat in the dim light of the safe house. They've lost their foothold here, but their reach extends far beyond Kiev. We need to prepare for the next strike. Taras joined them at the table, his presence a grounding force. He spread out a map, marked with locations across Europe and Asia where the cult's activity had been reported. They'll regroup, he said grimly. And when they do, they'll come for us. Oksana stared at the map, her fingers tracing the lines of ley energy that Ravinsky had mapped out. Then we need to finish what we started, she said. We need to find the remaining fragments and destroy them. Ravinsky shook his head. The fragments are scattered across the world, hidden in places of immense power. Even if we find them, we don't have the resources to destroy them all. Taras leaned back, his expression thoughtful. We don't need to destroy them. We just need to seal them, lock them away where no one can reach them. Like we did with the ley lines? Oksana asked. Taras nodded. Exactly. But we'll need help. Someone with resources, connections, someone who knows the cult better than we do. The name hung unspoken in the air for a moment before Oksana voiced it. Natalia. Ravinsky stiffened. You can't be serious. She's one of them. She was, Oksana countered. But she broke away from the cult years ago. If anyone knows where the fragments are, it's her. Taras and Ravinsky exchanged uneasy glances, but eventually relented. It's a risk, Ravinsky warned, but it might be our only chance. Natalia Kostuk was a ghost. Once a high-ranking member of the Awakened, she had vanished after a schism within the cult. Finding her was no easy task, but Taras had connections in the underworld, and after weeks of searching, they tracked her to a remote cabin in the Carpathians. The woman who greeted them was a shadow of her former self. Natalia's once proud demeanor had given way to paranoia, her eyes darting to every corner of the room as though expecting an ambush. She welcomed them reluctantly, her voice tinged with bitterness. I left the cult to escape Ri'shal, she said, pouring tea into chipped cups. And now you're dragging me back into it. We don't have a choice, Oksana said. You know what they're planning. If we don't stop them, Ri'shal will rise again. Natalia's eyes softened, a flicker of guilt crossing her face. You're right. They won't stop. Not until they brought him fully into this world. She pulled a weathered journal from a hidden compartment in the wall and placed it on the table. This is everything I know about the fragments. But if you're going after them, you'll need more than information. You'll need strength and sacrifices. Armed with Natalia's journal, the trio began their hunt. The first fragment was located in an abandoned monastery in Romania, its walls covered in faded frescoes depicting apocalyptic visions. Oksana and Taras fought off a group of cultists guarding the fragment, narrowly escaping with their lives. The second was hidden in the catacombs of Paris, where the sigils on the walls seemed to come alive as they descended deeper into the darkness. They placed protective wards to seal the fragment, but not before Taras was injured in a brutal skirmish. The third fragment brought them to a desert temple in Uzbekistan, where the heat and isolation made the whispers in Oksana's mind almost unbearable. It was there that they encountered a new leader of the Awakened, a towering figure who radiated an aura of pure malice. The battle left them scarred, but they managed to seal the fragment with Natalia's guidance. By the time they reached the last known fragment, exhaustion had taken its toll. The fragment was buried beneath a ruined fortress in Norway, surrounded by icy waters and guarded by the most devoted members of the cult. Natalia joined them for this final mission, her presence a reminder of what was at stake. The fortress was a labyrinth of frozen corridors, the air thick with the oppressive energy of the fragment. As they approached the central chamber, the sigils on the walls began to glow, and Oksana felt the whispers surge back into her mind. Welcome, the voice of Ri'shal rumbled, filling the chamber. You have come so far, only to fail. The cultists attacked, their ferocity unlike anything Oksana had faced before. Taras and Natalia held them off while Oksana and Ravinsky worked to seal the fragment. The ritual required blood, an offering to bind the fragment's power. You'll need to use me, Ravinsky said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. It's the only way. No, Oksana said, tears streaming down her face. We'll find another way. There is no other way, Ravinsky insisted. This is my purpose. With trembling hands, Oksana completed the ritual, using Ravinsky's blood to activate the wards. The fragment pulsed violently before shattering, its energy dissipating into the icy air. The cultists fled, their connection to Ri'shal severed. The destruction of the final fragment left the cult in disarray, but Oksana knew their victory was incomplete. The whispers had faded, but they were not gone. Natalia disappeared after the mission, her guilt driving her into exile. Taras returned to Kiev, vowing to rebuild and prepare for future threats. As for Oksana, she carried Ravinsky's sacrifice with her, a constant reminder of the cost of their fight. She stood on the icy cliffs of Norway, staring out at the endless horizon, and felt a flicker of hope. The world was safe for now, but in the depths of her mind, a faint voice lingered, promising that Ri'shal would return, and she would be ready. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to the channel, and I'd love to hear your comments.